website, or you could shoot them an email. But in terms of validity for any information, what you try to do is to get different sources that will give you the same information. So you need maybe 3 documents. So like in research, it's called triangulation, which means that you verify something by looking at maybe 3 different sources that have nothing to do with each other, so that you can verify it for yourself or have a level of confidence for yourself that the information is accurate. Now, for example, one of the authors, she talked about how her aunt told her that her sibling, the aunt's sibling, was never married, but yet she's saying, I found a marriage certificate. So that's an example of sometimes people don't know the information, or again, sometimes they're family secrets. Maybe she got married and didn't tell the rest of the family, but she kept her certificate. So that's something to be aware of too. So that's just an example of the need to verify the information that you're getting. You can also look at diaries, family tree, a funeral card, a funeral program. And one thing about a funeral program, if you notice, very often it will have a photo. It will have dates, it will have an obituary, and in the obituary it will talk about where that person came from, it will talk about their parents, their grandparents, nieces and nephews. So obituaries are very significant sources of information. When I was living in South Carolina, the church that I attended was a very small, close-knit church, and like one of the families just adopted me. And they had a family reunion and invited me, and part of their family reunion, they did go to land that was, quote unquote, the plantation in the past. And they did have a relationship with the people. So they're an example of a family that I know that had that type of positive relation in terms of being able to get information. And this,
I just want to share, these are some documents, wherever there's a document, just give it to them. Just give people what you got.
I asked Tariq just to pass out for you because that brings up a point about different types of documents. So you can have these. These are just extra copies. I just wanted to give you an example of different types of records. So like you said, the bill of sales, for example. So you can find those records, and you might find a person's name. It may or may not be a name. They might just be described as, a colored gal, and it may just have like an age and size.
Yeah.
But so sometimes you might have more information, you might have less information. Different religious groups sometimes will have that information also. For example, like in Michigan, there are actually Quakers who have been very helpful in keeping those records because they were helping people on the Underground Railroad. So you can get those documents from them. Or it could be something advertising someone for sale on the auction block, for example. And so those records you can find at your various archives. So it could be an archive for your town, for your county, for your state, and then there's the National Archive. And so these documents that are coming around just give you an example of what you can look at to try to get that additional information. And once you just start digging, for example, in New Orleans, one of my colleagues from Michigan who was in the Genealogical Society with me, she's from New Orleans. And she was able to get a wealth of information because her family was Catholic. And the Catholics kept very detailed records. And New Orleans has a system of parishes. And they kept details about the member's birth, their marriage, it could be confirmation, their marriage, and their death. So she was able to find a lot of detailed information through the Catholic Church. So that's an example of a resource. Okay, also looking at letters. So again, a letter might just have dear sister, and then you don't know, well, what is sister's name? Or it could be an official letter. So look for those documents when you're going through your family's materials. For your county, for example, or for the state, wherever it is that you want to get information, you can contact them and actually try to get the original documents. You can also look up the census data. So those are places to start in terms of piecing together the information in addition to what you can find in your home or in the person's home or people's files. And the files, it could be a true file, it could be a drawer, it could be a box. It talked about that deeds were put in photo frames because it was so ornate. So sometimes the deed is in a photo frame. Or you can find a document, they said, in the back of a frame. So it might be folded up and on the back of a photo frame. So you can look there. News clippings, a death could be listed in a death notice, or it could be listed as an event, or it could be listed in general news, or it could be listed with obituaries. So definitely you can get the newspaper clippings, and as the Mormon site was saying, they are working on digitizing these documents so that you don't have to go all over the country trying to get into a library and look at microfiche, but they're making it easier for you to get this information online. And so you don't have to pay for all of the information that you need. And a key about military records is to also look for a pension application. So if you know that someone was in the military and that they passed, see if there's a document in your family's documents about a pension application. And so that would give detailed information about the age of service, the length of service, where they were based. Right? So in addition to just the general maybe enlistment papers or discharge papers, look for latter years for the pension application. So usually that's something that, let's say, the person would have filled out, or the spouse, the wife, the widow would have filled out. Photographs, as we mentioned, programs, souvenirs, that gives an indication of where people may have traveled. Voter registration card, as Professor Carter said, you may have to get the voting information from the Bible. And where you can find it, as I mentioned, the archives, and it could be somebody's attic, maybe an attorney has it, a lawyer. It could be in a bank safe deposit box. So you have an old trunk. I need to add that to the list, old trunk. So the issue is, do you know where the bank, who knows where the bank safe deposit key is? So that's a question. It could be in the basement, it could be in a cardboard box that you don't even know it has that wealth of information. And it's very interesting, like this photo that I showed of my mom and dad, my dad holding me up. My father just pulled that picture out like a couple months ago. And my mom's like, oh, she's seen that picture numerous times. And I'm like, I never saw that picture before. So, I mean, that's an issue too, where the family just thinks they've seen it, so they think you've seen it, or they think that you know, and you don't know, or you don't remember. Like, for example, I was telling my mother, and she actually came to our MLDK program. And so she was talking to me on the phone, and she's like, oh yeah, when you were younger, I took you to the Schomburg. It had just opened, it was small, and I didn't remember that at all. I didn't even know that she had taken me to the Schomburg. I knew she had taken me to New York many times, and I knew like she had taken me to the Whitney Museum. And she was saying, oh, when I took you to the Whitney Museum, I took you to the Schomburg. So that's why we need the photographs. And I know even with my own niece, like I'll take her somewhere. I've taken her to the Newark Museum. And then she said, oh yeah, Grandma and Pop took me. And I'm like, no, I took you. So, me, Pop and I took you. And so now I take a lot of photographs on them. So she always has this evidence of who took her. So, I mean, that is a point also that we have to keep that oral tradition, keep those stories, because people forget. And especially children or teenagers, they forget. So we have to keep telling those stories and make it a tradition. So if you're not having a family reunion and telling those stories, then you got to figure out, when are you telling these stories over and over again so that people don't forget? And that's how you keep the ancestors alive in the Afrocentric tradition. The saying is that you keep them alive by you keep calling their name. You remember them. So that's why it's important to call their name when you do libation. You have to keep them alive. In terms of absence, especially if the family doesn't know. So they could think somebody just went off and disappeared. And so when you're going through your history and you come across people where the family says, well, they just left. Even in the Steplight, what I just read, and it talked about one of the members who went off. So hey, I need to look further into that, for that name, for the person that they said went off, meaning they went away. The family didn't really know them. So that's a really good point. for me to look at, okay, well, what happened to them? You know, did they get incarcerated? Did they get put on a chain gang?
Yeah.
Were they in a land lease system? Is that what really happened to them? As opposed to us thinking they just walked away and disappeared. So that's an excellent point. Of course, their library, I mentioned, shoebox, special place. So lastly, I'll just conclude here, just a few points. In her book, How to Trace Your African American Roots, Discovering Your Unique History, Barbara Thompson Howe gives a very comprehensive summary narrative guidance about how to document family history. So this book is basically, you can see it's just a summary, but it's a really excellent book, this one. The book that I just gave you the documents from, that Tariq passed out for me, this book has like a lot of examples of documents. So it's very helpful for someone who's beginning, because it lets you know what types of documents there are and what they look like, and try to figure out how to read them and find meaning in them. And so this second book with the documents, it's called A Genealogist's Guide to Discovering Your African American Ancestors, How to Find and Record Your Unique Heritage. And it's by Franklin Carter Smith and Emily Ann Kroon, published in 2003. Now, looking at birth records, I just wanted to note that Howell, who from the summary book, she says that as recently as 1910, only 10 states in the U.S. required registrations of birth. By 1925, that had grown to 33. It was not until 1933, however, that all the states in the U.S., 48 at that time, routinely required birth registration. So that's just something to note. As we talked about, a birth could be recorded on a piece of paper. So as you're doing your research, to just be aware of that. So I have various documents up here that you could look at. And I just put them here. For example, I put Frederick Douglass here because Black History Month, when it started as Negro History Week, it was to honor Frederick Douglass as well as President Lincoln, as I mentioned. So I just put this replica of a stamp of him up here. And just an example of a news clipping. This is a friend of mine, Linda Epps, who used to be director of the North Historical Society. So she's a wealth of information, a local treasure. And I just put this here because this is Dr. Tyson, who's the director of the Hayden Planetarium in New York. And it's just the notion of looking at history just in general to show that there's a scientist. So he's an astrophysicist, and he's a man of color. So when we're talking about the Black family and the dearth of information that we can find, we have to be able to keep it in our minds, in our kids' minds. So how does that relate to Harriet Tubman, follow the drinking gourd? And so we have someone who's the director of the Hayden Planetarium. And so we have to think about those things. So who were the scientists in our family? You know, what did they do? Who had that as their occupation? And we have to look for that. And then just over here, thinking about rites of passage. So when we look back to Africa, so our roots in terms of the village, but then we know we had rites of passage. So here we have cotillions. So this is actually a friend of mine, her twin daughters in Michigan were in this cotillion. But that relates to our Afrocentric roots of rites of passage. How do you prepare someone to become a young woman? How do you prepare somebody to become a young man? So where are the documents about that, about a rites of passage, or a Sweet 16, or a newspaper clipping about a cotillion? And as a matter of fact, I just put this photo up. My mom is a QA, because they were the wives of the Qs. So they had this organization. And so a lot of these women in here have been friends since before I was born or I was a little girl. So like my friend whose twin daughters are there, her mom and my mom have known each other since we were little girls, and they're still friends. And this is just one of their bookmarks. So it's history. It says QS, Auxiliary of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, Upsilon Phi Chapter. And they had a reunion September 16, 2006. And then on the back, it talks about their purpose.
And so the purpose was to give support of any kind to Upsilon Phi chapter. And it talks about the motto, "Blessed are they who have the gift of making friends, for it is one of God's gifts. It involves many things, but above all, the power of going out of oneself and appreciating whatever is noble and loving in another." And it talks about their colors are red and white. So these are just examples of the documents that you can see, no matter how large or small, or that maybe you haven't thought of, programs. For example, my mother was president once of National Council of Negro Women, so we have that. So this program becomes family history, and she was honored by the Urban League in 2005. So that becomes part of our family history. And then NAACP honored her, and so that was April 2007. So then you can look, and then so for example, there's a page honoring her for community service. So that becomes a part of family history and local history. So we have to look for these types of documents, and we need to keep these documents. So if you're going to a program, that means somebody has to keep the documents and file them. You have to recognize the value in the document, that this is going to preserve history for the younger people in the family. So this is my niece and my nephew, and my sister-in-law makes a calendar with their photos every year. And so, for example, this is the calendar she made for 2013, and it says from Super Mario and Alia. So it doesn't even have my nephew's name, because he is so into Mario that she put Mario on here. And then like every month, it just has different photos of them, and she puts like different dates. So this is just an example of including young children in your documentation that your family has. So, and also thinking about, how you influence, what magazines. So I grew up with Ebony in my house. So that's how I learned a lot about history and the value of history and family. Or you look at something like Positive Community. So this is an issue about Christian love, and his church is in Irvington. And then I went to visit his church, and so this is a program. So a church program is important, an important document also. So, and I put this apple here, because have you heard the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Right. So that's something. Do we want our younger generations to be like us, or similar to us? Are we instilling values that we want to see perpetuated in them? Do we want to be able to say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and be proud of that? Well, thank you very much.
One more minute before you start moving around. Maybe Dr. Johnson might have a couple of minutes or a little while that she can stay so that you can see these things that she has.